The Antarctic wind howled against the research station's reinforced windows, a stark contrast to the calm inside the scientific outpost. Dr. J. Park stood near the main monitoring station, her fingers tracing the complex holographic displays, showing environmental data from their long-term climate research project. Something unusual flickered on the screens. A strange energy signature began to pulse outside, creating ripples in the electromagnetic field that made the station's equipment tremble. Hyun Kim, the communications specialist, looked up from his console with a puzzled expression. "Dr. Park, we're detecting an anomalous reading," Hyun called out, his voice tight with tension. Before anyone could respond, a massive crystalline structure materialized around their research station. It wasn't a ship in any traditional sense, more like a living membrane of light and complex geometric patterns that seemed to breathe and pulse with an alien intelligence. The researchers froze. Years of scientific training couldn't prepare them for this moment. No protocols existed for first contact of this nature. The walls of their station began to shimmer, losing their solid form, becoming translucent, and then transparent. Wu Li, the team's lead engineer, reached for an emergency communication device, but his hand passed through it as if it were a hologram. The technology around them was dissolving, becoming something else entirely. "Everyone stay calm," Jay commanded, though her own voice trembled slightly. Beings moved outside the dissolving walls. They weren't humanoid in any traditional sense. Their bodies seemed to shift between solid and liquid states, with multiple sensory appendages that changed color and shape with each movement. These were the Rylonians, a species so advanced that human perception struggled to comprehend their true nature. One of the beings approached, its form rippling like water mixed with starlight. A communication field expanded, not through sound, but through direct neural transmission. The researchers felt waves of intention washing over them. Curiosity, scientific interest, and a strange form of clinical detachment. Specimen collection initiated. A thought pattern communicated directly into their minds. Sue Park, the team's youngest researcher, felt a surge of panic. Her thoughts raced. This wasn't a typical first contact scenario. They weren't being contacted or studied. They were being collected like biological samples. The station's environment began to transform. Walls became adaptive membranes that could reshape themselves. Equipment dissolved and reformed into strange configurations. The very air seemed to become a living substance that analyzed and categorized everything it touched. Min Kim tried to speak but found his voice was now a series of light pulses rather than sound waves. The Rylonians were restructuring their entire perceptual environment, turning the research station into a perfectly controlled habitat. Outside, the Antarctic landscape disappeared. The crystalline structure created its own environment, a perfect replica of Earth, but sterile and precise. Every detail was mathematically calculated, every natural variation removed and replaced with perfect symmetry. The researchers realized they were no longer in control. They were now specimens, collected, preserved, and prepared for study by a civilization that viewed them with the same clinical interest a human might view microorganisms under a microscope. Jay Park looked at her team, their expressions mixed: fear, wonder, and a growing determination. Whatever these beings intended, humans had always been adaptable. Whatever test or study they were about to undergo, her team would find a way to understand, resist, and ultimately survive. The Rylonian primary collector, a being of pure energy and complex mathematical patterns, approached closer. Its intention was clear: study, categorize, understand. But it had no concept of the human spirit, the unpredictable nature of intelligence that couldn't be contained by perfect geometric structures. As the transformation completed, the research station became a living museum exhibit. 7 human researchers stood at its center, watching their world reshape itself around them. Their adventure was just beginning. Little did the Rylonians know that they had just collected something far more complex than they could ever imagine. The collection was complete. Or so they thought. The habitat looked perfect. Too perfect. Sterile white walls curved in impossible geometric patterns, creating an environment that felt more like a laboratory than a living space. Dr. J. Park noticed how everything seemed designed to observe and control their every movement. Wu Li spent hours studying the walls. They weren't just walls, but living membranes that could change texture, color, and composition with subtle electrical impulses. He realized these weren't just barriers. They were advanced monitoring systems that could analyze everything. "We're being watched constantly," Wu whispered to Hyun Kim, who was examining the floor's strange crystalline surface. The floor itself was fascinating. Each step created micro-vibrations that were instantly recorded and processed. The Rylonians had created an environment that was part habitat, part massive data collection system. Every breath, every movement was being analyzed and documented. Su Park discovered something interesting. The habitat's technological systems had complex patterns, but they weren't perfect. There were small gaps, tiny inconsistencies that could be exploited. She began mapping these vulnerabilities, creating a mental blueprint of their artificial world. Min Kim focused on the communication systems. The habitat seemed to communicate through light waves and complex electromagnetic signals. By understanding these patterns, they might find a way to send their own hidden messages. One day, Wu deliberately walked in an unusual pattern across the floor. The walls immediately shifted, trying to analyze his movement. But he had intentionally created a sequence that confused the monitoring systems. A tiny glitch appeared, almost invisible but definitely there. Jay watched her team with pride. They weren't just surviving, they were learning, adapting. The Rylonians thought they had created a perfect containment environment, but humans had always been masters of finding unexpected solutions. The habitat had recreation areas, scientific zones, and living spaces. Everything was meticulously designed to make the humans feel comfortable while simultaneously studying them. Plants grew in perfectly controlled environments. Water flowed through transparent tubes that could analyze molecular composition with each drop. Hyun discovered that the lighting system wasn't just about illumination. It was collecting data about human biological responses. Different wavelengths were tested, measuring everything from emotional reactions to cellular changes. "They're treating us like an experiment," Hyun explained to the team. "But we can turn this experiment around." Sue began developing small technological interruptions. She would create tiny electrical signals that would momentarily disrupt the habitat's monitoring systems. Each disruption was so small that the Rylonians wouldn't notice, but it was teaching the humans how to manipulate their environment. Wu started working on communication devices. Using parts from the habitat itself, he was constructing something that could send encoded messages. The materials were adaptive, allowing him to create tools that seemed to grow from the environment itself. The team realized their strength was in their collective intelligence. Each person brought a different skill: engineering, communication, data analysis, strategic thinking. The Rylonians had collected them as individual specimens, but they functioned as a unified system. One evening, during what seemed like a routine monitoring period, the team exchanged a series of carefully choreographed movements. To the habitat systems, it looked like normal activity. But to them, it was a complex communication method that the Rylonians couldn't decode. Their habitat was becoming less of a prison and more of a training ground. Every system was a potential tool, every limitation a challenge to overcome. The Rylonians thought they were studying humans, but humans were studying them right back. Jay looked at her team and saw not prisoners, but potential liberators. They were transforming this perfect, sterile environment into something unexpected, and the Rylonians had no idea what was coming. The habitat continued its perfect, precise monitoring. But beneath its smooth surfaces, a revolution was quietly taking shape. The habitat's monitoring systems hummed with constant activity, unaware of the subtle changes brewing beneath their precise calculations. Sue Park sat quietly, her fingers moving almost imperceptibly across a small device she had carefully constructed from the habitat's own materials. Communication was their primary weapon, not through sound or traditional means, but through complex patterns of electromagnetic interference that looked like random noise to the Rylonian monitoring systems. Each subtle signal was a piece of a larger puzzle they were constructing. Woolley had discovered that the habitat's quantum-based infrastructure had minute weaknesses. By creating microscopic disruptions in the energy flow, he could send coded messages that appeared to be nothing more than background radiation. The Rylonians prided themselves on their advanced technology, but they had overlooked the human capacity for creative problem-solving. Hyun Kim worked on decoding the habitat's internal communication systems. What seemed like random light pulses and energy waves were actually a complex language. Slowly, he began to understand their patterns, their rhythms. Each discovery was a small victory. Dr. J. Park observed her team with a mix of pride and tension. They were transforming their prison into a strategic planning center. Every system designed to contain them was becoming a tool for potential escape. Min Kim focused on the habitat's biological monitoring systems. He noticed how the Rylonians collected data, precise, clinical, but lacking the understanding of human unpredictability. He began introducing subtle variations in their daily routines, creating data points that would confuse the monitoring algorithms. The team developed a complex communication system using almost imperceptible movements, light, reflections, and microelectrical signals. To the outside observer, they looked like they were simply existing. But each movement was carefully choreographed, each interaction a coded message. Days turned into weeks. The Rylonian monitoring systems continued to collect data, believing everything was normal. They saw patterns of human behavior, recorded biological responses, and tracked every minute detail. But they missed the revolution happening right before their sensors. Sue created a breakthrough. She discovered a way to inject small packets of encoded information into the habitat's background radiation. These packets looked like random energy fluctuations but contained complex messages that only the team could decode. Wu modified the habitat's own technological infrastructure. Small changes that were so minute they would escape immediate detection. Each modification was a step towards understanding and potentially controlling their environment. The team's communication became a silent symphony. A hand movement here, a specific way of standing there, a particular pattern of breathing, all became part of their hidden language. The Rylonians continued to record everything, believing they were collecting pristine scientific data. Hyun's breakthrough came when he realized the habitat's communication systems used a quantum entanglement method. By understanding this, he could create micro-disruptions that would send messages across the entire system without raising suspicion. Min developed biological camouflage techniques. He found ways to modify their physiological responses to make them appear exactly as the Rylonians expected. But beneath this perfect compliance, a plan was taking shape. Dr. J. Park knew their revolution had to be silent, careful, and precise. One wrong move could alert the Rylonians to their true intentions. Every action was calculated, every strategy meticulously planned. The habitat continued its perfect monitoring. Lights pulsed, walls shifted, energy waves collected data. But beneath this perfect surface, a human revolution was growing. Quiet, determined, and incredibly dangerous. The Rylonians had collected what they thought were passive specimens. They had no idea they were nurturing the very intelligence that would become their greatest challenge. The silent revolution was well underway. The moment arrived without warning. Min Kim's carefully constructed plan was about to unfold. Each team member had a specific role, a precise moment to act that would create a cascade of technological chaos. Woolley had spent weeks mapping the habitat's critical systems. He identified the quantum connections that held the entire structure together, delicate threads of energy that could be manipulated with microscopic precision. His fingers hovered over a device he had constructed from the habitat's own materials, a weapon of pure technological subversion. Dr. J. Park gave a nearly imperceptible nod. The signal was subtle, a slight movement of her hand that would trigger their carefully orchestrated escape plan. The first disruption began deep within the habitat's core systems. Sue Park's programmed algorithms started creating impossible data patterns. To the Rylonian monitoring systems, it looked like normal background noise, but each pulse was a carefully designed instruction that would gradually destabilize the entire structure. Hyun Kim worked on communication systems. He introduced a series of quantum entanglement disruptions that would make tracking their movements impossible. The Rylonians' sophisticated monitoring would see nothing but random energy fluctuations. The habitat began to change. Walls that were once perfectly smooth started to shimmer and lose their solid form. Energy conduits that had seemed stable began to pulse with unpredictable rhythms. The Rylonians' perfect scientific environment was becoming something else entirely. Min triggered the biological camouflage systems. Their vital signs would appear completely normal, masking the true nature of their plan. To any external observer, they were simply existing, calm, compliant specimens. Wu's device started its primary function. It wasn't destroying the habitat, it was reprogramming it. Each system was being turned against itself, creating a cascade of technological confusion that would look like a natural system failure. The first signs of panic came from the Rylonian monitoring centers. Energy patterns became unstable, tracking systems began to fail. What had seemed like a perfectly controlled environment was suddenly becoming unpredictable. Jay watched the transformation. Years of scientific training, of understanding complex systems, had prepared them for this moment. They weren't just escaping. They were proving something fundamental about human intelligence and adaptability. Communication systems began to collapse. The habitat's perfect monitoring became a maze of conflicting signals. Walls that could change shape suddenly lost their ability to maintain structural integrity. Energy flows became chaotic, unpredictable. Sao's final algorithm triggered. It was a masterpiece of technological manipulation, a series of instructions that would make their escape look like a system-wide failure rather than an intentional breakout. The Rylonians' response was slow, confused. Their technology was so advanced that they couldn't comprehend how their perfectly designed habitat could be failing. Each attempt to stabilize the system only made things worse. Min initiated the final stage. Their biological signatures would slip through the failing systems like ghosts, undetectable, impossible to track. The habitat that was meant to contain them was now their perfect escape route. Wu's device reached its peak performance. Critical systems began to collapse in a carefully choreographed sequence. To the Rylonians, it would look like a complete system failure, not an intentional escape. Dr. J. Park stepped forward. The walls around them were no longer walls. They were becoming pure energy, dissolving into complex patterns that the Rylonians couldn't understand. Their escape was mathematical, precise, almost beautiful in its complexity. The first Rylonian monitors began to show true confusion. Their perfect specimens were doing something impossible. They were escaping through the very systems designed to contain them. In the final moments, the habitat became nothing more than pure energy, a complex, mathematical equation that the humans had completely rewritten. They weren't just escaping. They were proving that human intelligence was the most adaptable force in the universe. The calculated escape was complete, and the Rylonians had no idea what had just happened. The small craft moved silently through the vast darkness of space, its design a bizarre mixture of stolen Rylonian technology and human engineering. Dr. J. Park sat at the improvised control system, her fingers moving across surfaces that seemed to shift and change with each touch. Behind her, the team worked. Quickly, Wu Li was converting their stolen technological components into communication systems that could broadcast across multiple galactic frequencies. Su Park was creating encryption codes that would make their message impossible to block or ignore. Hyun, Kim monitored the surrounding space. Their escape had been perfect, but they knew the Rylonians would be searching. Every movement had to be calculated, every communication carefully planned. "We're going to send a message," Jay announced. It wasn't just an escape. It was a declaration. Min prepared the communication systems. They had collected months of data about Rylonian communication networks. Their message would be transmitted in a way that would force every advanced civilization to pay attention. The message wasn't just about their escape. It was a statement about human potential. They had been collected as specimens, treated like samples in a scientific collection. Now they would show the galaxy who humans really were. Su's encryption was a work of technological art. The message would break through communication barriers, bypass filtering systems, and become impossible to ignore. It would be broadcast across multiple frequencies using quantum entanglement methods that the Rylonians themselves had developed. Wu fine-tuned the transmission. Each word, each signal was carefully constructed. They weren't just sending a message. They were creating a communication that would redefine how the galaxy viewed humanity. The first transmission began. It wasn't an aggressive declaration. It was something more powerful. A calm, precise explanation of what had happened. How a group of human researchers had been collected, studied, and had ultimately outsmarted a technological civilization considered far more advanced. Galactic communication networks began to light up. The message spread faster than any traditional communication method. Advanced civilizations received simultaneous transmissions that told a remarkable story of survival, intelligence, and unexpected capability. Yun monitored the responses. Confusion, first, then curiosity, then something that looked like respect was spreading across interstellar communication channels. The Rylonians' communication networks showed complete bewilderment. Their perfect specimens had not only escaped but were now broadcasting their story across the galaxy. Every detail of their capture, their time in the habitat, and their eventual escape was being shared. Min watched the data streams. The message was clear. Humans were not just another species to be collected and studied. They were adaptable, intelligent, and capable of turning any situation to their advantage. Jay's voice was calm but strong in the transmission. "We are not your collection. We are humanity." Those simple words began to echo across multiple communication networks. Scientific databases, diplomatic channels, research institutions, all were receiving the same message. The team had transformed their escape into something more than just a personal victory. They had created a galactic declaration about human potential. Rylonian monitoring centers began to show signs of complete confusion. Their most carefully collected specimens had not only escaped, but were now controlling the narrative of their capture. Wu's technological modifications meant the transmission would continue, repeating, spreading, becoming impossible to block or ignore. It wasn't an attack. It was information, pure, clear, and undeniable. Su continued to modify the transmission, ensuring it could not be interrupted or filtered. Each civilization receiving the message would understand the same thing. Humans were not to be underestimated. The small craft continued its journey. Behind them, the message continued to spread. A declaration of human capability that would change how the galaxy viewed humanity forever. They were no longer specimens. They were a force to be recognized.